All right, tonight we've got Mark Gober with us, the author of a fantastic book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, dispelling the myth that the brain produces consciousness and the implications for everyday life. And Mark's got an interesting story about how he started out in business and started listening to podcasts, which kind of led from a materialistic, kind of skeptical view of the world to writing this awesome book, kind of battling materialism. So it's really good to have you on and chat. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's awesome, man. I read most of the book, skipped some of the inside because we've talked about a lot of these topics before and done a lot of the research, had people on that have done a lot of the research and that you reference in the book. But I don't know where you want to start. I mean, I'm always interested in the journey of you, and I love the journey of the materialist changing to really like start looking at the evidence. So there's evidence all over the place for this. That hey, our brain doesn't create consciousness. So maybe we could start with that, but I mean, I definitely want to leave time for talking about the implications, which you wrote, quite a large section of your book is the implications of how this change in thinking can affect our daily lives.
Yeah. So my background, as you mentioned before, is in business, and I still work in business. I'm a partner at a firm in Silicon Valley called Sherpa Technology Group, and we advise tech companies on their business strategy and on their intellectual property. And prior to that, I worked in investment banking with a large firm called UBS in New York. That's what I do professionally. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until 2016, August 2016 was the first time that I got wind of some of this stuff. But prior to that, I really just had never heard of, first of all, the question of consciousness. That wasn't even on my mind. I thought there was just kind of a foregone conclusion that the brain is what produces consciousness. And when I say consciousness, I mean the subjective inner experience that we all have right now, where we all have this awareness that's not really tangible. And my assumption was that we already know that comes from the brain. There's a lot of complex stuff happening in our skull, and it produces the awareness that we have. So that has a big set of implications if you take that literally. If you say that the brain is what produces consciousness, then when the brain dies, when the body dies, then it's over. That means there's no consciousness, no memories, no feelings. So with that set of beliefs, it's hard, if not impossible, to come up with meaning in life. So I didn't talk about these things, but in the back of my mind, I would always say life doesn't really matter. It's just a rationalization to think that anything matters. And if I'm going to be honest with myself, then I can't come up with meaning when there isn't any meaning. And that was kind of how I thought about things, but never questioned it much because I thought science was just converging in that area, and that we had moved away from other sets of beliefs as a society. So when I first stumbled across these podcasts in 2016, it started with Extreme Health Radio, which it's a health show. I wasn't even trying to learn about consciousness. I was listening for alternative health stuff. And they had a woman on named Laura Powers who talked about her psychic abilities and the ability to communicate with non-physical entities and to work with energy. It was the first time I had heard anyone speak about those topics beyond science fiction. So at the end of that episode, Laura mentioned her own podcast, which is called Healing Powers, where she interviews other people that have had these types of experiences. And I ended up listening to that whole podcast dating back to their 2011 episodes. So I listened to like the whole thing very quickly. And it got to the point where there were so many independent accounts of this stuff from people that were not connected to each other. So I couldn't reason that they were all lying. I was just very confused. I'm like, wait, is there some kind of mass delusion going on, or what's the deal here? And that led me to then do a lot of the scientific research that I chronicle in the book. And after researching for a year, it was just a year's worth of really nonstop researching outside of the office because I just wanted to understand this stuff. And for me, it was a very radical shift in just how I thought about life. The book came later. It was after that year of research that I said I wanted to put it on paper. But my initial intent was just to understand this stuff so that I could understand more about who and what we are and what this reality is that we're in. Because I think having that basic underpinning is what governs how we act in the world. And if I had to shift the most basic assumptions, then that has big implications for how I think about just the meaning of my own life.
Yeah, that's super interesting. We found that on the show over the last 5.5 years that people are starting to open up to these experiences that are generally unexplained in the mainstream paradigm. And I think that that's one of the things that, on top of all the evidence that is out there, and on top of all the like the challenges with getting peer reviewed journals, like these things into peer reviewed journals, which you also talk about in the book, is just the amount of experiences that people are having, or that they know of loved ones that have had it, and that they're able to now. It seems like we're finally getting to the point where people feel like they're comfortable enough to share this, and now we can sit here on the show and talk about this kind of thing. I think that's one of the big things that's helping as well. And I'm glad that you recognize that, because for me, that's one of the big parts, is not just the science of it, but the sheer amount of anecdotal evidence that people are having these unexplained experiences.
Yeah, that was a big one for me. And what I've noticed now that I've come out with this book is that more and more people are opening up.
Yeah.
And they'll say to me, well, I've had this experience, but I never felt comfortable speaking about it. So that's what I'm finding, is that these experiences are not uncommon. And that is not surprising, given that I now think the reality we're in is a consciousness-based reality. So these things are actually not paranormal at all. They're what you would predict to happen.
Yeah. So what were some of the other things that attracted you to go down this rabbit hole after hearing powers and the sort of the psychic part of it? What else, sort of, what other kind of areas of this drew you in further?
To me, the biggest draw was that there were so many different areas. So ranging from psychic phenomena like telepathy or remote viewing or precognition, to things like near-death experiences in children who have past life memories and mediumship. There were all these independent areas that did not conform to the materialist assumptions that the consciousness is confined to the brain, consciousness is produced by the brain. But those phenomena, all those different phenomena that I explained and more, those could be explained by this alternative paradigm, by saying, no, consciousness doesn't come from the brain. We just have to view the brain differently, more like a filter of consciousness or an antenna receiver or something, some kind of processor rather than the producer. So that was a huge thing for me, that it wasn't just one area. It wasn't like a really good study on telepathy, even though that exists. The fact that there are so many different areas.
Were you surprised that all the science that was already established for this, all these different areas? Because there's a lot of studies and a lot of research in each of those areas that you talk about. Yeah,
I'm still surprised. I mean, the fact that the U.S. government had a 20-year program, 20-plus-year program on remote viewing during the Cold War, that Princeton had a lab for nearly 30 years run by the former dean of engineering, that the University of Virginia has been looking at children with past life memories and other phenomena for more than 50 years. These are big institutions that are looking at this stuff and that are finding evidence. So I'm still surprised by it. And it's one of the big pieces of feedback that I get when I just talk to friends and other people about these topics is that initially they don't know how to respond if they've never heard these things before, because they just haven't even heard of the evidence. So it's difficult to refute it, other than, wait, if this were real, then more people would be talking about it. And yet they're not. So there must be some trick here, and it must be fraudulent. And I think that there's really an information asymmetry. The information isn't getting out there enough. And that's why one of the reasons I felt so compelled to write the book, to put all this evidence into one place so that it's not so out there anymore, that this is just what science is now pointing towards. Like in any other kind of scientific revolution we've had, there's an accumulation of evidence, and then all of a sudden the paradigm shifts.
Yeah.
So if it's a consciousness-based reality, is that more along the line? Do you think that more along the lines of if our brain's not creating the consciousness, is it like a kind of like we're like an ant where we're feeding off some sort of a group consciousness, or is it something more along, something larger than that,
like cosmic,
something cosmic, or is it is it some sort of a simulation, or which way do you think it points there?
The way I think about it generally, and I think it's difficult for the human mind to try to conceptualize and linearize these concepts that are so maybe even beyond what we can comprehend. But the reason the book is called An End to Upside Down Thinking is that what I'm calling upside down thinking is the idea that matter is fundamental in the universe, materialism, and consciousness comes from matter through a material brain. And what I'm arguing is the flip, which is that consciousness is fundamental, as Max Planck, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, said. He said, I regard consciousness as fundamental, and I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. He said that in 1931. So the way I view reality is very much along the lines of what Dr. Bernardo Kastrup says in his book, which is called Why Materialism is Baloney. He says, imagine that reality is like a stream of water, where water represents consciousness. And each of us is like a whirlpool within that broader stream of consciousness. So the whirlpool is made of water, but there are delineations so that we have an individual experience, and yet we're still connected as part of the same consciousness. So that's the way I tend to think about it. And to quote Erwin Schrödinger, another Nobel Prize winning physicist, he says, in truth, there is only one mind.
Yeah. There is no cat. So it's like, it's close to like what Bill Hicks said, and we're just like the imagination of ourselves. I like that model.
Yeah. To me, that's a model that can account for all these different data points.
It can account for a lot of magic and stuff too, right? Then it all sort of, you can tie it all together from there.
That's how I see it, is that we can explain a lot of things if we just flip the placement of consciousness. It doesn't mean that we get rid of many of the things that materialism have given us. We've learned a lot from materialism, and we can still learn a lot from it. It's just recontextualizing it.
Yeah, it's not instead of, it's adding to, you know, it's both.
I agree.
Yeah, that's because I really like that, because I always like to argue that, you know, placebo, magic, affirmations, intentions, it's all the same. It's all a different stroke of the same brush sort of thing, or, you know, it's all the same somehow. And this kind of ties it all together. It kind of puts a nice little, it kind of gives it some context.
Exactly. And another thing that really surprised me as I got more and more into the research. So I should start by saying, initially, I didn't have this framework where I said, you know, it's a consciousness-based reality. Initially, it was a bunch of phenomena that didn't make sense. And then I heard of people that were arguing for this consciousness-centric picture, and I realized very quickly that it all fit together. But another reason I like that model is that the consciousness-centric picture conforms to our own experience, which is that we always experience things subjectively. It's always experienced as a consciousness, right? I see the computer, I see the chair. Any experience I have starts with I, the consciousness. So to say that anything exists outside of that experience is possible that it exists, it's just not provable. And if we take that out even further, do a thought exercise and say, imagine that there was a material universe, but there was no consciousness in the universe. Could that universe exist?
Yeah.
Right. Technically, it could exist, but we could never prove it because we would not have any consciousness there to actually verify that it exists. So ironically, materialism, which says that matter is preceding consciousness, that requires a leap of faith that something could exist prior to and outside of consciousness. So that to be really, really skeptical, I think it would be to start with consciousness, because it's the only thing that we can actually know for sure. And it's interesting that Albert Einstein, back in the 1930s, he was a materialist, but he acknowledged that this was a leap of faith. So he was a materialist, and he said, I cannot prove that my conception is right, but that is my religion. Yeah. Acknowledging that leap of faith that's required to accept materialism. Yeah. So to me, the really skeptical position is that all we can know is subjectivity, is consciousness. So to start with consciousness just makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. And it's very similar to, didn't you find some similarities with ancient Eastern religions and stuff like that as well? I mean, this is kind of stuff they've been talking about for thousands of years on a more, esoteric level.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what I'm finding, is that all of the mystical traditions, whether it's the Eastern religions or Kabbalah and Judaism, Gnosticism and Christianity, Sufism and Islam, they all speak of this kind of universal consciousness that we're a part of, and they just say it in different ways.
Yeah. The Akashic record.
Exactly.
Well, yeah, that too, right? I think that's the equivalent of the cosmic thing you're talking about, like the cosmic level of consciousness. To me, seems like the Akashic records, where your receiver, your antenna is just tapping into that infinite library of knowledge of everything and that ever was and ever will be. I mean, maybe time's not even there. It's just you can tap into the past and the future, and
until you eat a bunch of mushrooms. Where do the psychedelics fit into all that?
So the way I view the brain, so there's a big question still, even if we accept this view of consciousness and reality, what's the brain's role? Like, we know that if you get injured and you might have memory loss, we change the brain, we change the conscious experience. You stimulate a part of the brain, let's say the part of the brain responsible for vision, then the person has a change in vision. So there's this really tight correlation between what happens to the brain and what happens to our consciousness. So we know the brain's related. And the big question, the big assumption in materialism is that correlation is the same as causation. Because there's this tight correlation, it must therefore be true that the brain is producing consciousness. And we know that from statistics, that's not always true. And there's a great analogy from, again, Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, who says, imagine that you have a fire and lots of firefighters show up. You have a larger fire and more firefighters show up. We know that the firefighters aren't causing the fire, even though there's a strong relationship between the firefighter's presence and the existence of a fire. So the question is, what is another way to explain this relationship between the brain and consciousness? And getting back to your question about psychedelics, is if we view the brain as being like a filter of consciousness, where the brain is actually limiting the consciousness that we experience, then we might expect there to be a pattern where if we reduced brain functioning in certain cases, then we would see enriched conscious experience. We see that with the near-death experience when a person has little or no brain functioning, and yet they have this extremely lucid and logical experience where their consciousness is active. Another example is psychedelics, where there are emerging studies, particularly with psilocybin, where the person is tripping on the psychedelic, and yet they have a reduction in brain functioning.
Yeah.
So that it fits the pattern of a reduction in brain function associated with heightened consciousness.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that was quite a surprise to the researchers when they realized that.
So if that's the case, then it's quite possible that when you die, man, it's pedal to the metal.
People who have had near-death experience, that's what they say, is that the brain is really just limiting our experience. So we've got it all backwards. The brain is, it's the way I like to think about it is, if consciousness is the sun, then the brain and our thoughts and our feelings and emotions, they're like clouds that are actually blocking us from pure consciousnness. And when people get in these altered states, whether it's psychedelics or a near-death experience or other things, they're experiencing consciousness in a richer way.
Oh, I've never thought about it that way. So even the people that are having the NDEs and they're astral traveling, they come back, or that oneness, even just the spiritual experiences that could come from normal means, and people come back and say that was more real than real life. Like it felt more vivid, and that makes sense because your brain is kind of like that. It's filtering all that.
So say a fellow is gonna, say, I know a guy who might be eating some mushrooms in the next couple of weeks here. Is there anything he might be able to try that he could try out for us and report back and let us know, like something to test? Is there any way that we could test anything, any of your stuff? Is there, if you had a test subject?
It's a good question.
My friend is the test subject, not me.
Well, my understanding from this is that the intention that is set, the mindset going into it is important for the type of experience that you'll have. So if the intent going in is to try to experience more of the sun, so to speak, more rays of the sun, or if we use the stream analogy, it's like experiencing more of the stream rather than just your individual whirlpool. Maybe that's one way to do it. The issue with a chemical substance is that you sort of lose control. The chemicals are going to change the way your brain's functioning. And I wonder, I think more research is needed on whether or not we can control the experience, and if so, how.
We got ground to chaperone.
I'm not doing I'm not chaperoning anymore.
He's our variable.
I get enough of that.
Huh. Well, do you think it is the sun? Because I mean, I really like the idea of the growing Earth theory, and it's got that whole pair production thing. And I wonder if the same process couldn't have something to do with consciousness. I mean, if you can create matter at a energy, then you can probably, the same thing could be what's generating consciousness.
I think it needs to be explored. I'm way more open to stuff like that now than I used to be.
Yeah.
Huh. So, I mean, I want to spend some time on the past life stuff, the kids' past life stuff. Like, that stuff is always fun for me because I had one of my daughters especially talked about, past lives, or she'd hint at past lives or talk about. And the interesting thing with her is it was always like the same sort of people centered around each other. So she'd be like, oh, when I was your dad, or when I was your brother, or whatever, So it was interesting, and there's always so many of those stories. Did you have any? What was it like? What was that chapter like? That research in that, because that's the kind of stuff that really blows my mind when you can actually prove or find some proof or evidence of this kid's story. That's, you know, some of them are just mind blowing. Could you share some of that chapter with us and what it was like writing that?
Yeah, well, actually, when I got into the research on past lives, it was probably one of the first things that I heard about just through podcasts. And it was typically when people were under hypnosis and they would enter a past life in this altered state, and then they would kind of release a trauma. But then I looked into it even further and saw that there was more rigorous research done at the University of Virginia. So I mentioned this before, 50 plus years of research at UVA, their Division of Perceptual Studies at their med school. So this is a very credible institution, which again really shocks people when they first learn about it. And I think you're right. The most compelling cases are the ones where the children have distinct memories that can be verified or validated by historical or medical records. So there are a few cases that Dr. Jim Tucker, who's taken over for Dr. Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia, that he's been chronicling. One is a Hollywood extra, a little kid who basically thought he was in Hollywood, and he identified himself in a book, and it was an extra. It wasn't even a star. And they ended up finding the person they ended up finding this person, and the things that the kid was describing were aligned with this person's life. And they actually went back to his house, and he saw his daughter as a little kid and basically said the daughter had changed because he was thinking of himself as the father, even though he was this little child.
Wow, that's crazy. I remember the one about the airline. I think there was like a kid that was an airline pilot, and then when they looked back, they found out all the information about the crash and the pilot and all that. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, it was a World War II pilot, and the kid, his name was James. He would take little toy airplanes and smash them into the coffee table. And Jim Tucker at UVA, he said when he went to the house, he saw the indentations on the table, and James would say, like, airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out. And they ended up finding the exact person that he was referring to. It was a single plane that crashed during World War II.
Yeah, that's crazy.
It almost proves reincarnation, eh? You know, some of that shit's just like, I don't know.
Well, and then you get into the whole, like, did we go up there and plan our next life out? And did we, is this life an agreement or?
Yeah, that's what I was going to mention when I was talking about my daughter's experiences, is that, it was always the same sort of people in the group. So it's like, you're a group, you're a soul group kind of going on it's like you meet up with a bunch of people and go to the amusement park together, but instead you go on this crazy fucking ride called life for a couple of decades or a couple of generations or whatever the fuck, however it works, who knows. But I always like that idea of the soul grouping and stuff like that, because it seems like you would learn more that way. Maybe not. I could see an argument for both, actually, but.
Yeah, to me, there's a lot of strong evidence that reincarnation does exist. And there's also research at the University of Virginia where the children have birthmarks and physical deformities that match the way in which they describe dying. There's actually a physical transference of information or something like that. So I'm convinced, excuse me, that the evidence for reincarnation is strong. So if we accept that reincarnation is a real thing, then is it just a random process, or is there a system behind it?
Yeah.
And I have a hard time thinking that it's just totally random if it exists at all. Now, what that system is, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing I liked about
it's DOS based.
He's Darren's stuck on the digital simulation kind of thing and all that, and it's that's an interesting way to go as well. I mean, we can almost get into some of that later on about. You do have a chapter in there about the technological aspects of that with Kurzweil and these guys. But before that, the other thing I liked about that is the amount of quotes you included from prominent scientists. I mean, when you start looking at all these quotes as well, it makes you wonder how we ever ended up in this materialistic paradigm. I mean, a lot of the top scientists in our past weren't really so rigid materially. And now... I mean, that gets into the whole, I'd like to ask you about the intention behind that and what you think is why we ended up here as well over the last couple 100 years.
Well, it was really important for me to show those quotes, both for my own peace of mind to say that I put the best stuff forward, but I think also for the readers, it's important to see that much credibility from people like Max Planck and Erwin Schrödinger. These are big names. And even people like Brian Josephson, a Nobel Prize winner in physics, he's still living. He says he thinks that telepathy is real and that quantum physics will help us understand that it's real. And what's been very interesting to learn is that basically, if the minute you start talking about these things as a scientist, no matter who you are, even if you're a Nobel Prize winner in physics, there is a major taboo against this. Yeah. So Brian Josephson was uninvited from a scientific conference because they heard about his interest in the paranormal. Yeah. And they said something to the effect of, well, this is a scientific conference and it wouldn't be appropriate for someone with your interest to be here. So when I hear things like that, it actually makes sense to me that these ideas haven't been able to catch on because there's so much opposition to it. And I talk about what goes on Wikipedia that really shocked me, where apparently it's difficult, where certain people take over Wikipedia pages and write things that are typically negative about these topics, and then it's difficult to edit. Yeah. So there seem to be forces at play here that are making it more difficult for the ideas to gain traction.
Yeah. Yeah, the guerrilla skeptics there with what's his name? The guy that was on, Rupert Sheldrake. Yeah,
Sheldrake,
he experienced that with the guerrilla skeptics on Wikipedia.
On morphic resonance and all that.
Yeah.
Because there's a chapter on pet stuff.
Yeah.
I like that stuff. You know, I was actually, me and Lisa were just talking last night about, I forget which pet it was, but I think it was Bailey. Oh, yeah, because Bailey always seems to know when you need a hug. And I was like, and then I brought up Sheldrake's work, and I was like, well, I think, there's some science that shows that the dog knows when you leave work or stuff like that. Did you come across any of that in your studies? What was, good? Can you tell us some cool pet stuff?
Yeah, that was interesting for me, and I included a chapter on it because I think many pet owners can relate to these ideas where they think their pet seems to know things. And Rupert Sheldrake has been the leader in this field, which I wish had more research behind it, but for many reasons we might be able to understand, there isn't a lot of funding going towards animal psychic abilities. I mean, there's not enough towards human psychic abilities, let alone animals. And so I give Dr. Sheldrake a lot of credit for really digging into this. The most compelling case to me is the research he did with Pam and her dog JT, where they videotaped the dog when Pam was taken far away from home in a cab at a random location. She wasn't even told when she was going home until the experimenter texted someone that she was with, again, miles away, not in her own car. So he tried to get rid of the conventional explanations, which is, well, the dog must have just smelled it, or the dog knows when she's coming home because it's
every day at 5 o'clock, or
yeah. So he controlled for all that, and he found in nearly 200 trials that there was a strong relationship between when the owner was deciding to come home and when the dog walks to the window. So you can actually go to Sheldrake's website. He has a video demonstrating one of the trials. The owner, she's sitting far away. She hasn't even gotten in the cab yet. She's deciding she's walking to the cab, and the dog starts walking to the window.
Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing.
Cats too, or just dogs? Do cats suck? Dogs better than cats, or cats better than dogs?
My cats are waiting for me on the stairs every time I come home.
On the stairs?
Yeah. They're cats sleep like 18 hours a day or whatever, but they're waiting for me when I get home.
Well, they can probably hear you clamoring up the stairs.
No, I think it applies to many different animals.
Yeah.
Sheldrake's best tests have been on dogs, to my understanding, but he's looked at others too.
Yeah. So getting back to the suppression aspect of it, or how we ended up in this place, you mentioned some of those examples, guerrilla skeptics and people not allowing to be at conferences. I mean, you also talk a lot in the book about, not even be able to get, so it's not only that, you don't have a peer-reviewed study, it's like you can't even get into a lot of these peer reviews. As soon as it's about the paranormal, sometimes they're not even looked at. And the one thing I did like about the quotes that you put in there as well is you put a lot of quotes in there that also show how silly the skeptical community is about how they haven't even looked at the research. They won't look at it because it can't be true, because we live in this paradigm that they think it's all already settled. So, I mean, I like that aspect of it. But I also kind of want to dig a little bit deeper into, like, how did we get there? How are these guys able to just keep controlling the narrative? It just drives me nuts.
Well, it's really similar to what happened with Galileo versus the church. He had all his evidence in the telescope, which suggested that the Earth is not the center of the solar system. And there were clergymen that didn't want to look in the telescope. So we have a lot of examples of that where scientists say, well, of course I haven't looked at the evidence. Those things are impossible. Or, look, I only have a fixed amount of time, so I'm only going to focus my research on things that are likely to be real. So there's that kind of force, but I think there's a real incentive for established scientists to try to keep the paradigm because they don't want to be proven wrong. And I'm not sure this is true for everybody, but I've heard this from some of the scientists that I've spoken to. And I actually have my own podcast coming out later this year. I've interviewed nearly 50 people, many of the people that I mentioned in my book. And some of them have said to me that they hear from scientists who say, look, if what you're doing is real, then you basically invalidate my whole career. I'm paraphrasing there. So there are people with real incentive. If you have an ego to be right, think about it. This is a very threatening point of view. And it's the prevailing point of view that's out there. It also implies that people would have to shift their worldview, which takes work. And I can say that from personal experience. It's not an easy thing to say, wait a second, everything that you thought was real in your life, it's only partially true.
Yeah.
So that's tough.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think that is it just a case that it's business? Because it's funding studies as well, right? I mean, they got to keep getting funding. And a lot of times they're not going to get funded for, this type of stuff. So do you think it's just mainly a case, or is there a more nefarious intention going on for people? Because there is a reason why you would want to keep us and keep the culture in this materialistic paradigm. I mean, if you get into that about the the implications at the end of your book there, but do you think it's just basically business and people trying to hold on to their paradigm to be right, or is there deeper than that?
I've heard different theories about more nefarious ideas. I really don't know enough.
Yeah.
I really don't. There are lots of theories out there, but even if we exclude those, I think there are forces that just make sense as to why these ideas wouldn't get out there. But at the same time, what this whole idea implies is that each of us is much more powerful than we've been taught. And that certainly is threatening to much bigger forces. So I don't know.
Exactly. That's kind of what I mean. Like, there's more meaning to life. There's more meaning to our intention, what we focus on, all that stuff, right? Like Darren was saying about, all the manifesting and magic and all that stuff just is more realistic if you look at it this way.
Yeah. And it puts a different spin on how we might live day-to-day life. And I'll give an example from the near-death experience, the phenomenon known as the life review, where a person, again, this is when they're in some kind of physiological trauma like cardiac arrest. They're clinically dead, and yet they have these lucid memories. And for a lot of reasons that I just state in my book, I don't think these are hallucinations. Mm-hmm. So the life review is occurring during this time where we don't think the brain should be functional, and it's often not functional. So we might interpret this as something that's actually real and not a hallucination. And if we accept that, then the life review is really critical. And this is an experience where the person goes through their whole life in a flash. They're observing how they acted towards other people. Sometimes they take on the perspectives of the people that they affected. Mm-hmm. So I'll give you an example. I recently spoke with Darren Brinkley, who's had 4 near-death experiences. He just had his 4th recently. I remember reading about his prior 3, and he just had his 4th during open heart surgery. He's had a life review each time. And he was a Marine in Vietnam where he killed a lot of people, and he said he was pretty cruel. So during his life review, he experiences the deaths of the people that he killed from their perspectives. But he also experiences the pain of the people that knew those people that he killed.
Oh, wow.
So that's a very profound idea, if that's really what happens. And when you talk to people who study near-death experiences, they all say something similar, which is the life review is something that we all have. Yeah. And that starts to get to meaning in life, that these people come back saying it's not about material goods. It's literally just about how we're treating each other, and we're put in different situations to see how we do.
Yeah, it comes back to the relationships and unconditional love and all that stuff. And I mean, it makes me wonder if that's what the Christian version of hell was. I mean, if people are having near-death experiences all along and they come back and say, I died, but I came back and I saw hell. Like my life was, my life review equals maybe hell.
Yeah. It raises a lot of questions. And then aside from those experiences with the life review is like other more negative realms that people experience. It's a minority of near-death experiences, but they're reported as being very scary and terrifying. So when I hear that, and I've heard of different conceptions of hell, it makes me wonder, If there's something going on, maybe it's a state of consciousness, it's another dimension.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. That's super interesting.
Yeah. I like Superman's quote that your biggest fear in life shouldn't be failure. It should be succeeding at things that don't matter. A good way to look at it. Yeah, I'm more and more, I'm thinking that it's all about relationships and being kind to each other and being kind to people and communicating properly and
Service, being of service.
yeah.
Yeah.
And if you do all those things, I mean, that's when everything else seems to start to work out, I think, too, right? I mean, in most cases. I mean, I think you get some cases where maybe it doesn't, but I'd like to think those are rare.
Yeah, I mean, what people typically talk about from the life review is not only relationships that are important, but the intent behind the actions, typically as they relate to relationships. But it's the intent that goes into things. So talking to Dannion Brinkley was really interesting because for him, the life review started at the beginning during each near-death experience. So he had to relive things 4 times, but because he was older, he got to relive new experiences that he hadn't in the prior life reviews. So I asked him if things have improved, and they have. I mean, he now volunteers in hospices. His life has changed dramatically, and he experiences also the joy that he brings to others when he's in the life review state.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah. It's kind of like, yeah, what the Buddhists say too about that. About
Don't be evil.
Yeah, being of
That's
service
what
and
Google
all that.
says,
And
but I don't believe them.
so what about this? What about the Kurzweil and these guys and the singularity and the people that are more like, you know, the technology is gonna assist in our evolution or our spiritual experience, and like, are they going along the same lines as the materialists? Do they not realize that yet that consciousness is outside, or are they using that to further the technology? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, when I hear about AI, it's typically, I think there's typically a materialist assumption that
Yeah.
that underlies what people are talking about, because they say there's this idea that we can make a computer complex enough to the point that consciousness suddenly emerges.
Yeah.
And a great example of that is the show Westworld,
Yeah.
where the machines reach a certain level of complexity and all of a sudden they have memories and then they start taking over, and it's this like apocalyptic scenario. That assumes that consciousness can be produced by this machine.
Yeah.
That's the way I interpret it. So I think AI definitely could be dangerous, but to me, it's more about the way we program the machines. It's about the consciousness of the programmer. And that's actually something that Federico Fagin, who is one of the original inventors of the microprocessor, he is saying this idea that consciousness is primary and that we need to rethink AI debates. And it's not as much about the AI itself, it's more about how we program the AI.
What
I've heard that's what that, yeah. Was he the guy was that the same guy that was on Rogan recently?
I'm not sure.
He's in his whole program is the open source one, and that was an interesting take on AI that because AI is always doom and gloom, but his take was interesting. It's still a fucking coin toss. That's the thing, is it still seems like it could be a coin toss. But I mean, I got a lot of pop culture influence, so.
Well, I don't understand what do you mean by open source? Like open source?
Well, like
in the
he's
code,
saying,
or
like they're
like
opening up, and it's like once they get everything they do, the code's all readily available.
Oh, I see.
So
What you
saying
mean,
they
like
don't
that.
want it to be a military power. They want it when it happens, it's just going to be uploaded to the cloud and let it fucking do as it may on its own accord. Like just, I don't know. I'm not a computer engineer, so I don't really understand how AI works. But I guess you could just like write the code for it on my computer. I write the AI code. I hit send. Boom. It's on Twitter, everywhere. Is that how it works? I don't know. I might just be talking crazy nonsense.
I always
don't
picture
know.
it. I always picture it as. Go ahead, and then I'll say what I was going to say.
Yeah, to me, what needs to enter the debate, I think, is the question of consciousness. Can we create consciousness from a machine? That question is often not even asked.
Right. Well, what if it's creating the machine that then can transceive or receive consciousness? Like, I think we talked a couple years ago with somebody about that, and it was like, if you develop, like, let's just say a fake brain
What's
or a
consciousness?
complex enough organism, or maybe it's a simple enough organism that'll just and it could be a machine that something can enter into it, consciousness can enter into it from our, you know.
Yeah. Well, it's a good point. I mean, we are all conscious as beings, so that means our body's doing something to process consciousness. The question is, how is it doing that, and is it something that we can replicate outside of ourselves?
Yeah.
So that is really the question. Can we recreate however our body and brain are receiving consciousness in something else?
Yeah, exactly. And then it's like, can you put your consciousness somewhere else?
You know, that's interesting. I remember that conversation actually where we were talking where they could find that maybe my iPhone is conscious and I don't even know it. But, you know, did they eventually you get the right mix of circuits and gears in the back? Maybe it's in it's in the basement of the parkade where they have like the electronics recycling bin and everything gets in there in just the right order. And maybe it gets struck by lightning and boom, consciousness. I mean, is that any crazier than how it happens now?
Not really.
Right?
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, I mean, there's something that people talk about, the idea of panpsychism, that matter is conscious. That's typically how it's construed, that consciousness is just a property of matter.
That's why it's a pansexual. I get it. Yeah, I like that. Well, I mean, that's the same. That's like an extension of the masculine feminine. I can't remember which one. Is it Buddhism or which one is it that says not just, I mean, obviously all people have masculine and feminine in them. It's just which is dominant, and it happens to be that it's usually dominant more in men and women, vice versa. Anyway, but I forget which one is it, Graham, or
I don't know. I don't think you're on the right track with that. I think panpsychism is something else.
No, past that. We're past the pan thing. Oh no, panpsychism where everything has a consciousness.
Yeah.
So is that the same thing? Is that an extension of every because there's some sort of religion that has every object has a masculine and feminine aspect to it.
So the way I look at panpsychism is that it's still a form of materialism, because it's saying that matter has consciousness. The consciousness comes from matter. So the distinction that I would draw based on what I've seen is that still consciousness is primary, and it's experiencing itself through the material world. Through different forms of matter, consciousness is expressing itself.
Yeah. I prefer that than the other way around. Yeah, I see what you mean. That doesn't fit within the upside down view of it.
Right.
That would explain why the matter is really like nothing. Like this table is just nothing. It's mostly nothing, but it looks like a table. But if my consciousness is making the whole thing up anyway, then he's like, it's a table, motherfucker. Take it or leave it. I don't care what your microscope says. It's a table.
That's a great point. The idea that the physical world isn't as solid as we think it is. Like you said, matter is mostly empty space. Each atom is 99.99999% empty. We know that from science. We know from the double slit experiment in quantum physics that when you're not observing, the particle behaves like a wave, meaning it doesn't even have a definite location. So what we call matter isn't even solid unless we're looking at it. And when we are looking at it, it's mostly empty space. And we're saying that matter, that we don't even really know what it is. There's a great quote from a physicist. He says, matter is not made of matter. So the materialist perspective is this mysterious matter stuff. We don't know what it is. And that is creating the consciousness that we have.
Yeah.
The one thing that we know is created by this unknown quantity.
Yeah, I still can't wrap my head around that. How this table must be vibration then, right?
It's a field.
Little atoms.
It's a field, and this field can't go through that field.
Yeah.
It's a farce.
Yeah.
It's an interpretation. Yeah. We interpret it as solid table, solid chair. And that's just how our brain labels things based on the sensations and the way we perceive it.
I wonder what the world really looks like. Like, I wonder if there's going to be an app one day where instead of looking for Pokemon, I just take my phone and I'm bloop, and it's like what the world really looks like. And it's like, who knows?
You can change the setting to how your cat sees the world, or
how you notice is like when I take a picture on my computer and I look at it and it's all wonky. And it's probably like that all the time, because when I eat a bunch of mushrooms, allegedly, my computer looks like that all the time.
Yeah.
I can't type, I can't read things because something's missing or something's extra or however that's working. I can't read my computer or my phone or anything. Like I can read a text message, but it takes all of my concentration to focus in on it. And it's kind of the same idea when you take a picture of a computer screen and send it to someone. You know, it's got that weird sort of effect on it.
Well, on the topic of seeing and not being able to see well, in my book I talk about near-death experiences where there are people who have been blind since birth or are colorblind or have just a visual difficulty. They go into the near-death experience state and suddenly they can see perfectly. And then they come back in the body and they go back to having the impairment. So it's again like the body's actually limiting our perception.
Yeah.
Our biological system is a limiter.
Yeah, what was again, I was listening to someone on Rogan the other day that was talking about the cure for blindness. In 2020, they're doing the first safety studies on curing blindness. I'd be interested in knowing what exactly the science behind that is. What are they doing? Are they, you know, maybe it's as easy as shutting something off.
I don't know.
On? Would it be off or on?
Well, in the near-death experience, the body's basically off, and yet the vision seems to be perfect. So I don't know.
And then yet in lucid dreaming, it's it's similar to you on mushrooms or somebody on mushrooms, is you can't read very well. You know, like if you're lucid or you're dreaming, like you can read.
Are you speaking from experience or?
Yeah.
Allegedly.
Yeah. So let's get into the implications. Like the last part of your book is, you know, talks a lot about all the different implications, and you answer a bunch of questions in there. And you want to get into that part of it? I mean, I think that's pretty important.
Is it any more hackable this way? How can I cheat? How can I game the system? Just more love?
If we think about
more love? Love more?
I think that seems to be an important theme, but from maybe a more practical standpoint of doing day-to-day activities and enhancing intuition, I think looking at the U.S. government's program with remote viewers where people could see things that were far away without seeing it with their eyes. So sort of like accessing a distant part of the stream with your mind. What Russell Targ advised his subjects to do was to quiet their monkey mind, essentially go into a meditative trance-like state and allow information to come in. So it gets back to this idea of the sun and clouds. We can enhance our intuition and these abilities for day-to-day activities, seemingly by entering these meditative states where we quiet the mind.
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
I'm not good at that.
No, I'm not good
Actually,
at
I did my
remote
first
viewing.
little meditation yesterday. I think I did okay.
That's good.
But it has to be guided one.
Yeah,
It's
you
like
can.
making that weird noise, like meow, wow. I did okay. I think I lasted 10 minutes. I didn't fall asleep.
That's good. Good
Do
start.
you meditate, Mark? Do you have any practices like that, or?
I do. I'm also not the best meditator. I think flotation tanks, sensory deprivation tanks, those are great.
Yeah.
Because you have no light, no sound. Even if you're sitting there thinking, at least your brain is getting to rest. And I find that when I float, I do get some good creative insights, or I'll just get clarity on things that I wasn't sure of.
Yeah. Yeah, quiet down all that other sensory noise. Yeah, I agree. So
I haven't floated in a while, actually.
Yeah, you should try again.
It's been a while.
He just plays around in the float tank. You can't do
Sometimes.
that.
It's always fun, though.
What about implications for our culture that if we all because if we keep going like this, I mean, really, we are winning the battle against materialism. I think. I mean, I think they're grasping on, and I mean, these institutions, academia, they're holding on pretty strong. I think, but I mean, I believe that the skeptical community doesn't really have as much of a leg to stand on anymore, and I do think things are opening up because we have these conversations now. People can share the stories. So what's it going to be like when the culture in another 5 or 10 years, like you said, it shifts over to the other side and this becomes our reality?
It's really a shift in identity. The materialist perspective is that our identity is our body, and the consciousness we have comes from our body, specifically our brain. Whereas this other paradigm is that our identity is our consciousness, and we're experiencing the physical world through a body. And that even more than that, we're connected. We're interconnected.
Yeah,
we're
that's the
entangled,
thing,
to
yeah.
use the quantum physics
Yeah,
term.
we're all one kind of thing. Yeah.
Right. We're all part of the same stream, even though we might have different whirlpools, we're connected as part of the same stream. So the implications here are that we are not finite beings. In other words, this life isn't it, and we're not separate. Whereas most of, I think, mainstream society today is based on this assumption that we are finite and separate beings. And that, to me, creates incentives that are much more individualistic and in many ways selfish. And it's actually rational if you think that we're finite and separate beings. But if we're not finite and if we're interconnected, then the treatment of others, like we talked about, that becomes really paramount. So things like altruism, where you want to help somebody else, that actually becomes like a form of selfishness, because you're helping yourself if we're just the same one mind, as Schrodinger said. So to me, when we look at the world's problems, whether it's political or violence or anything, those problems stem from a metaphysical belief in materialism that we're finite and separate. And if we shifted that belief system, I think many of the problems we see would start to shift. So to me, it's about getting to the core cause of the problem rather than fixing individual symptoms of political leaders or individuals who are violent. Those to me are just symptoms.
Yeah, I agree. If we all realized we were connected, that would make a big, big difference in how we treat each other. You know, yeah.
It's what people say after the life review, and what they tell me is, look, you don't have to have a near-death experience to go through this. You can learn from what we've been through. That all that matters is about how we're treating each other in life. So for those people, it's just so real that they don't even deny it. But for the rest of us who haven't had that experience, it can be difficult to relate.
Yeah. So you think we'll get there in 5 or 10 years, or what do you think about the time frame of that?
It really depends on who you ask. So
yeah, totally.
Going through some of my interviews for my podcast, and one of the guys I interviewed, who's been doing this for a long time, Dr. Jeff Mishlove, I asked him about that, and he's seen this for decades, and he's seen the difficulty of how difficult it is to gain traction. So I think he's a bit more pessimistic.
Yeah.
He said closer to 200 years before this is mainstream.
Wow.
Well, I'll be dead by then.
Wow, that's crazy. I wouldn't think that at all.
But I mean,
it could be. But I mean, the dominoes seem to be lining up. Sometimes it seems like
it happens quicker.
If one starts falling, then they could all go a little quicker, but maybe not.
Well, I hope so.
I wonder if they were saying that, like, I could picture them saying that in like 1200. We got these motherfuckers.
Well, it reminds me of the whole UFO field too. I mean, the people have been pushing for disclosure for like 60 years, and everybody's like, "It's gonna happen. It's gonna happen." And then decades go by, and it doesn't seem like much changes. But that, as well as a lot of the other stuff we talk about on the show, does seem to be changing and does seem to be opening up. I mean, the government's admitting, like, these programs like you're talking about are, well known. People know about Stargate and the remote viewing and studying the UFOs. Even all that stuff seems to be seeping into our consciousness. I mean, we can talk about this like way easier than we did 5 years ago. So,
well, I think the fact that I could even write this book, that someone like me who just works in business was able to write a book with 700 some citations.
Yeah,
that says that there's a ton of evidence coming out from credible places. And there was also an article that I mentioned in the book that came out in 2018, published by the American Psychologist, which is the official peer-reviewed journal of the American Psychological Association, that does a meta-analysis of many of the psychic phenomena and shows a real statistical effect.
Yeah.
The journal approved that article. After all these decades of controversy, they still approved it in this mainstream journal. So that, to me, is a really big shift.
Yeah. So what are some of the other guys or scientists that you've interviewed on your podcast, and what's your plan with that?
Well, the plan is hopefully to release it later this spring. And the format will be twofold. One is just the raw interviews, sort of like what we're doing right now. And the other will be a little more creative, where it's a conversation between me and my producer. And my producer works more in the sports area of media. So he's kind of playing the layperson that's just being introduced to this. And we take clips from my various interviews. So an entire episode might be focused on near-death experiences, and it's me and my producer speaking. But we'll use clips from people like Dr. Eben Alexander or Raymond Moody, or other people that have had these experiences. So it's each episode centered on a topic, and we take multiple sources that we incorporate.
Okay, nice.
I'm the lay guy around here.
So would that whole, like, let's say you interviewed like Mishlove, and would you do something with that whole interview then, or would you just take bits and pieces of it and put it into your show with your producer? Like, would it be two separate things?
So the full-length interview will be available.
Yeah, that's awesome.
For the show, the shorter show where it's just me and my producer, we might take a few clips.
That's great. So you've launched, or you've recorded a lot of these, and you'll launch in a couple months, or?
I've recorded about 50 and we'll
Wow,
hopefully launch in the next few months.
that's
So
great.
I just, like I mentioned, Danny Brinkley was a great interview I did
Yeah.
recently. I also interviewed Russell Targ,
Oh,
who was one of the
nice.
laser physicists that ran the
Yeah,
Stargate program.
yeah, yeah. That's fantastic. Did you
It's a
what's it called? What's it going to be called?
TBD. We have not figured it out yet. We haven't finalized the
Oh,
name.
okay, TBD. Okay.
To be
Yeah, you're
determined.
gonna. Yeah, for sure. You'll have to touch base with us, and when it does come out, we'll.
No, if you need any
We'll
help or
talk
anything
about
like
it,
that
yeah.
along the way, we
Yeah.
don't know much. We still fuck it up 5 years later, but we try. We're always trying new
Yeah.
things. We could tell you what doesn't work.
Yeah.
Don't do
You guys do a
value
great
for
job.
don't do value for value. Just kidding. It's great.
So, any other interviews stick out? I mean, Targ would be great to talk to. And
Jim Tucker. I'm gonna email you later and see if you can put us in contact.
Yeah, I interviewed Jim Tucker, and he's got great stories.
Yeah.
Children who have past life memories. But it's just interesting talking to people that do this for a living, where they've spent their whole career studying these effects.
Exactly.
To them, it's not even a question.
Yeah.
In most cases, like, of course, this is real. I mean, if you're Russell Targ and you've seen people remote view everywhere, where you're just given a longitude and latitude, and the person's going into a trance and drawing it out repeatedly, it's not a question about whether these things are real.
Exactly.
And it's so interesting to hear that versus some of the skeptics or some of the mainstream scientists who say things like, there is no evidence for ESP and it's not even a controversy.
Yeah.
I quote that in my book.
Yeah. It's unbelievable. I mean, one of our favorite ones was the lucid dreaming. We interviewed a lucid dreaming researcher, and same thing, decades of research. And when you hear the stuff that he's studied with people in their dreams, and the precog from dreams, or the healing from dreams, I mean, it's mind blowing when you get into all the details.
It's mind blowing, and it's just not being studied enough.
Yeah.
By the mainstream. And so going back to Jim Tucker and children who have past life memories, that's important, I think, for medicine too, because if some of these children have birthmarks and physical deformities that are aligned with this alleged previous life, if that's a real thing, then it implies that there's something medicine's totally missing, because medicine says that there are two factors that affect our physical form. One is genetics, and number two is our environment. There's nothing else. Here, there's something else that the researchers are calling a third factor that affects our health.
Yeah.
Think about what a big deal that is if we're missing an entire factor.
Yeah. Even phobias. I mean, even for psychology. And phobias, I mean, the past life healing and the regressions, there's a couple different people that have their own protocols and all that, and sometimes it might be a 3 or 4 hour session, but just the act of acknowledging you've had a past life and what happened brings this healing for people. It's unbelievable.
I remember the early days of my research, I heard a woman named Myra Kelly on Laura Powers' Healing Powers podcast. And she was a corporate attorney, I think, had a very conventional job. She got really bad TMJ, horrible jaw pain, and she was going to have to be operated on by Columbia Med School or dental school. They couldn't figure out what was going on. She didn't want to have surgery, so she decided to try past life regression. And I think the first time she did it, nothing happened. But the second time, she had a flashback to being a slave in the South, wearing a chain on her neck, and it was rubbing up against her jaw in the same place where she currently had the TMJ issues. And after that hypnosis session where she had that memory, it like cleared the pain and it went away.
Yeah, isn't that crazy? Yeah. Yeah, it's somehow the act of just recognizing that is the healing. That's all you need. It's not like you have to do a bunch of work after that. Sometimes it just happens.
Acknowledging it.
Yeah, yeah.
Like that.
We should do it. I had a bit of a past life, and I was like, I think like a Templar or a Knight or something, and the year like 1110, and I think I had a sense that it was my that was my shield arm, and that's why I had this chronic elbow injury. Like I broke it when I was 5, and it's just been bugging me through my life.
Now it's better?
No, it's not better.
Oh.
No, it didn't. It never really healed. That's the problem. I never really thought about that.
Tough one.
Yeah.
I thought it's supposed to heal when you do that.
I know. That's, yeah. Well, because I broke it. It's physically stuck, right? It's not going to ever heal.
There is no physically stuck.
Yeah.
There is no physical.
So is there anything else you think you want to cover out of your book or out of what we're talking about?
Back to remote viewing, I was really shocked to find out that the CIA declassified certain documents. So I think your listeners might find that interesting if they weren't aware. I was able to include them in my book, and one of the documents says very explicitly, remote viewing is a real phenomenon. implications are revolutionary. And then they show the science panel that looked at it. And the science panel concluded that the evidence is too impressive to dismiss as mere coincidence. So I'm going to be really curious to see what a skeptical reaction to all of these things is. Like, I don't know what the counter is beyond just saying like, oh, it's fraudulent, but without evidence to support the idea that it's fraudulent, I'm not sure how someone can make that claim.
How's your remote viewing?
Not good.
No,
Mine either.
mine's not good either. But we have friends of ours that do a podcast, Cat in the Box.
Cat in the Box.
Justin and Adam, and they've been doing remote viewing every week. This is what they do. They've been doing this remote viewing thing, and they're getting some crazy hits. I mean, I've even taken a little like crash course in it as well in Calgary here.
Crash course? How much did you pay for that?
I don't know, it's like $50 or something maybe. It was one of our guests there. We had
I'm gonna
him
start
on.
giving
Like,
out.
but it's just I
You should
can't
be giving
do
the
that. I
remote
can't
viewing
do that.
crash courses. And the CSET. We should have Grimerica CSET school.
Yeah, can't do it. So the other thing I want to mention about your book too is you got a lot of praise and a lot of people writing about how good it is. I mean that's some good feedback you get there from people.
I appreciate it. I think it helps for me as someone who's in the business world. I'm not a scientist, but a lot of the scientists who have been in this field, like Eben Alexander and Dean Radin and Rupert Sheldrake, people like that. So they're behind the book, which I think hopefully will help get the message out. And that's really what I'm trying to do, is to get the book in as many hands as possible so that people can start opening up if they're willing to. I think it can have a very positive impact on people's lives.
Yeah, definitely. I was going to say at the beginning even that this book is the book that you give your family members or your close friends or these people that, you know, that are skeptical of all this. And this gives, it's like a little manual here
rundown
of, you know, of why we need to get away from materialism. So yeah, it's great, a great resource for people to give to their friends and family.
But I want to keep my iPhone. No materialism, still get the iPhone. Still get the podcast. You know, it's interesting. I got to thank you for that, because it's like, you know, people give you, it's interesting if people give you flack for being, you know, just a businessman or not being a scientist, because the problem is that the people that are the scientists doing the work are most of the time too busy to write the book, especially the overarching book that brings it together, because their books are fucking hard to understand and you need to be a scientist to understand it. So you need the, you know, the podcaster or the author or the documentary filmmaker, whoever it is, to sort of tell that story, because otherwise, you know, in today's specialized culture, without people like you sort of sewing the quilt together, it's just we're all just looking off in different directions.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I had some advantages as not being a scientist. Number one, I don't have an academic career to protect. So I could write things and include quotes that I had no qualms about, because I'm just objectively showing what I found. And also, I was able to write the book in what I think is a simpler form than maybe a typical scientific book. And I could use simpler language and not feel badly about it, because I'm not like defending a PhD or anything. Yeah. So I had those advantages and really wanted to make it accessible to a general audience.
How's it gone over so far? And then how about the people in your personal life that have seen you take this journey? Because it hasn't been very long. It's been 2 or 3 years since you started the whole process. So you hammered down pretty quick. What do they think?
Yeah, it's only been 2.5 years since I first started it. I think people have seen a shift in how I look at things and think about things, but it's still the same person. And that's something to emphasize to your listeners, is that it's like you just kind of, there's a saying, I can't remember where it's from, it might be in Buddhism, where at first there are mountains and rivers everywhere. And then when you learn about this real reality, they all disappear and there's nothing. And then the mountains and the rivers come back, but you're just seeing them with a different lens. And that's kind of what happened with me. When I first started with the research, it was so shocking and disorienting. I didn't even know who to talk to about it. Like, I thought I was crazy, and wait a second, are there any other people that actually know about this stuff? And then I realized that there were people, and started to open up about it, and it's become easier to speak about these things. So I think people definitely see a shift in how I approach life, but it's still ultimately just the same person.
Yeah. You realize there's a whole world of people talking about this stuff now. It's great.
Oh yeah, there's a whole world of crazies. Yeah, it's nice down here. It's comfy. It's warm. The weather's great. Everyone's kind to each other most of the time, unless you start talking about politics. And fucking look out. Other than that, it's a pretty nice place to be. Yeah.
That's what I found. People have been very supportive, who have been, I guess, people that are open to these ideas, or just open in general, have been very supportive. And the book only came out in October, so it's still pretty new. I think it'll be interesting to see what some of the skeptical reactions are, if they'll read it. That's
Yeah.
my big question, is if they'll actually read the evidence.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we're hoping that all our listeners will read the book,
Yeah.
recommend it to their friends. Where can our listeners track you down if they want more Mark Gober?
My website, which is my name, MarkGober, markgober.com. That has more information on me and the book, and we'll also be announcing the podcast there. Also on social media, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. As soon as we have more info on the name of the podcast and when we'll be launching it, we will let everybody know.
Awesome. Right
Excellent.
on.
Excellent. I can't wait for the show. Like I say, if you need any help with anything, let us know. And we'd
Thank
be
you,
happy
guys.
to help. We're eager to hear it. Eager to
Yeah.
hear some raw conversation there.
Yeah.
And the other concept sounds great as well. And yeah, anything else?
That's about it. Yeah. Thanks for coming on, Mark.
Well, thank you guys for having me
Yeah.
and for all the work that you do.
Yeah. Thanks for your book. Really appreciate it.
All righty. Of
Okay, buddy.
Hardcover too.
Take
I
care.
like
Take
it.
care.
Thanks for the hardcover.
course.
Have a nice night, sir.
You too.
And that was our chat with Mark Gober. What'd you think, buddy?
I think I need a fucking mouse. I think I need a mouse.
Yeah, it was good, eh? Yeah,
Yes.
it was like I'm not being silly. I'm being serious when I say this is the book you hand to people that are really not sure about materialism or they don't want to go down that rabbit hole.
I believe you.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
believe you. I'm actually gonna check because
It's a good read.
you know what's funny is like I just actually figured out who we were having on the show. Like a few minutes, well, not a few minutes, probably around this afternoon. I had a different guy. It was
Oh boy, here we go again.
it was a forensic geologist.
Oh, huh? Jesus.
And then I was like, and then I double
Thank God
checked.
one of us is
Yeah,
re-
it's a good thing somebody's paying attention. I was like, oh, I had all this geology stuff lined up, and then right at like 3 in the afternoon, I was like, holy shit, I got this totally backwards.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, great chat, wonderful.
It reminds me of the books. So just to put it in comparison, you remember Fringeology when it came out? Do you remember that one? That
We
where I
got that on the shelf.
Possibility in this genome. I don't know if we have it on the shelf anymore. We might. And then like Alex Sakaris's book, science. Science is wrong about everything. And there's a bunch of books that are like this, right? This is a good, thick, comprehensive resource.
Failed was feeling down today, so I promised him if he showed up to the live stream, I'd
Flash a nipple,
yeah.
or was it your tattoo that you're flashing? Your sigil. Was that your?
Is it a sigil? It's a good
Yeah.
sigil. Family sigil. Can that still get you in trouble?
No, these sigils don't always get you in trouble. Sometimes they're really helpful.
Really?
Sure.
That's good to know. So yeah, that was great. Big thanks to Mark for coming on the show. Thanks for the hard copy book. You don't get a lot of hard copies these days. Always like a hard copy book.
We can even keep this for quotes because there's a million awesome quotes from scientists in here.
But you know what the best part is? There's no jacket.
I took it off. I have the
I
jacket.
hate jackets.
I take them off.
But sometimes you take the jacket off and there's nothing on the cover.
Yeah.
And it's like, what the fuck? Then you're really in trouble. Anyhow. So what else? That's it.
That's about it. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
a good chat.
Big thanks to Mark for coming on the show. Buy his book, check out his website, all that fun stuff. While you're there playing around on the internet, head over to grimerica.ca/support. Sign up for a monthly on PayPal. If you hate PayPal, we're on Patreon, grimerica.ca/Patreon. Also on Stripe, grimerica.ca/Stripe. So you got 3 different ways to support the show. You can hide $20 bills inside a book and send that to the studio like some people do.
Oh, that's a great idea. We should. But
That's what we'll do when everything's shut
what if
down.
there's a bunch in there we haven't even looked? And we've got to look at this. Like you
Well,
probably
most
should.
of those come from the publicist,
There's
but now
gotta
we're
be
gonna
like
have to
a
start
note. There's
checking all
gotta-
the books.
Yeah, we got to check because there's got to be maybe like a little cipher or a note, some sort of symbol that says like flick through the pages because that would be a good way to donate to the show.
Absolutely.
Get a favorite book in the mail.
That's what we'll do when they shut everything else the fuck down.
Yeah.
Send the cash hidden in books. Anyway, Grimerica, you got to support the show because most people don't. So you could be part of a very exclusive club of supporters. I think we're about 800 names into the wall.
Nice.
Now, half of,
I thought it was like 340 or 350. Or
well,
something.
that's monthly supporters.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Right. So that plus Patreon for the straight, that's, but for the wall, I'm doing the one-timers too.
Right.
So we're at like 800. Yeah. So there's about 311 names left for the Wall of Fame. And you just support the show not because of the wall, just because you like the show. Just support the show so that we can still have the show and not get kicked out in the street. We made rent 2 months in a row.
Woohoo.
Let's go for number 3. We have some other surprise expenses that have come up. So
Yep. Listen to the intro for all the other stuff like Contact at the Cabin and reviewing the show and all that good stuff.
that's right. Most of all, have a good weekend.
Sure.
Thanks for listening. And we will see you next week. There you have it.
Thanks for everybody listening live too.
The livers, we got a super chat. We got
Oh,
a super
awesome.
chat from our buddy Failed.
Oh, thanks, Failed.
And we got a super chat from our buddy Bradley Knight, a 666 and a 399er. Always good. Pays for the stream tonight. It is illegal. It's illegal to send cash, I think. So we were just saying that.
Oh, is it
but
legal?
I don't know. We just say stuff. We don't recommend stuff. We just say stuff. Nothing that we say on the show should be considered a recommendation for
It's
anything.
entertainment purposes only.
That's right. I added that to the end of the new show. Yes. Yeah, and this is all just entertainment. We were fucked. What are we doing? What's the plan for tonight?
I don't know.
I haven't heard
check
from Jim Lee, so I got to assume he's coming on.
Yeah.
But he might not show up.
Yeah.
Because he's never set the invite. He hasn't emailed me back or anything. But we should have a show with Jim in about an hour and 15 minutes.
Yeah.
How long do you need for the intro?
To get ready for it?
Yeah.
10 minutes? 5 minutes?
15 minutes? Okay,
Not
so
even.
we'll be back at 7. So we'll be back in 17 minutes with an intro.
Yeah.
We're going to open up the box from Bill.
I hear Brody.
He's laughing already. We're back at 7. Kill it.